Hi, everyone. I wanted to welcome you to today's Sustainable Change Alliance conversation on sustainable business structures. I'm Christopher Gallo. I'm a financial advisor here at UBS in Santa Barbara. Been doing this for 28 years since I graduated from UCSB. I'm also a member of the SCA Foundation Board, and that's the role I'll play today as your host. This topic is super interesting to me because mostly I deal with public companies in my role. And so I'm not as familiar with B corporations and the like that we'll be discussing today. So I'm going to be a learner and a participant at the same time. For those of you that don't know, Sustainable Change Alliance is an impact-oriented, member-based, not-for-profit educational group. We're focused on impact investing, which we define as bringing financial and other resources to double and triple bottom line organizations that are trying to address a big social, environmental, or health-related issue, particularly here in Santa Barbara, but globally as well. I'd like to acknowledge first the hardworking and dedicated SCA board members, many of whom are on this call in the meeting. I'm glad that they're here. And we can't do any of this without our sponsors, so I'd like to list those quickly. Our founding sponsors are Argyle Capital Partners, which is Stephen, Impact Family Office, which is Kaya, Maps.com, and then UBS, which is me. Our platinum sponsor this year is Nixon Peabody Law Firm, and our silver sponsor is Brashears Insurance. If any of you are on the call that aren't yet a member of SCA Foundation, we'd love to have you. We're a great group. We've pivoted to these webcasts, these virtual events, but we've had a ton of great events over the past 2 or 3 years, and we're trying to have an even bigger impact in our great community here locally. So I'd encourage you to look at that on our website afterwards, where you can also see a video of this. And I should let you know that the meeting is being recorded so that people can visit that aren't able to be here in person. Everyone here is on mute except for the guest speakers and myself. So if you have a question or anything comes up, if you just type it into the chat box there, I think Stephen will be able to see it and relay it to us. So with that, I'd like to begin. First, I'd like to introduce our sponsors, and we'll have them each say a word or two about, or a little bit about their organization and themselves personally. Why don't we start with Avery Young from Everroot Consulting here in Santa Barbara.
Great.
Avery.
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you. I'm Avery. I'm a co-founder of Everroot Consulting. We are a social enterprise consultancy based in Santa Barbara, California. And we primarily work with purpose-driven business leaders in their effort to get BCorp certified. So I'm excited to share a little bit more about BCorp today and what it's all about, as well as hear about fair trade and Goodweave.
Excellent. Thank you. Look forward to hearing that. We were also really, really lucky to get 2 international organizations to be part of this conversation. First, we have Scott Welker, who's representing Goodweave International. Scott, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. First, I'd like to thank SCA for the opportunity. My name is, as said, Scott Welker, Vice President of International at Goodweave. Been with the organization for just under 14 years, and we're based in Washington, D.C. That's where the Secretariat is. Just briefly, our organization works to end child labor, forced labor, and bonded labor in global supply chains. And those global supply chains are producing goods for Western consumers. So we provide a product certification to supply chains that have met our rigorous certification standards.
That's great. That sounds really interesting and wonderful work. Lastly, but not leastly, we have Mary Linnell Simmons from Fair Trade America. Mary, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, it's great to be here. My name's Mary Linnell Simmons. I'm the Director of Marketing at Fair Trade America, which is based in Washington, D.C. We're an international organization and we have a presence in about 100 countries around the world. You've probably seen our little blue and green label on coffee, chocolate, bananas, every single pint of Ben & Jerry's ice cream. And what it means when you see that label is that the goods coming from the global south within that product, such as the cocoa, the coffee, the vanilla, have been ethically sourced. The farmers and workers who grew them were paid a fair deal. And similar to what Scott was saying, avoided child labor, bonded labor, and took care of the environment in their farming.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you all for introducing yourself. So I have some prepared questions, but we can make this a conversation. If anyone has anything they'd like to add, just pop in, and the audience obviously type questions as you see them come up. So Avery, why don't we start with you? You just mentioned it. What is a certified B Corp?
Yeah, great question. So a certified B Corp, they're businesses that commit to some of the highest social and environmental standards worldwide, and they seek to use their model as a force for good. So it's not a product level certification as fair trade or organic would be, but it's actually a company level certification. So any type of company can get B Corp certified of really any size or scope. And what really differentiates it from other certifications is that it's extremely holistic. So instead of just looking at a company's environmental footprint or their social impacts, it actually considers both. And it covers 5 different categories. So it looks at a company's governance. So that's like their general transparency, mission, and engagement. It looks at community. So are they actively involved in their community? Do they have a civic engagement and giving program? Are they volunteering or giving back? Then it looks at workers. So that's asking, are you paying your workers fair wages? Above the living wage? Do they have good benefits? Are they satisfied? Are they engaged? Or maybe do you have personal or professional development programs for them? So those are the type of questions that would be in the workers section. Then there's environment. So that would be, what's your impact on land, life, and climate? So looking at your energy, water, carbon footprint, all of those questions. And then lastly, if that's not enough categories, you have the customers section. So that is, are you building a product or offering a service with the betterment of your customer in mind? So it'll ask questions along the lines of, are your customers satisfied? And are you building a product for them? So as you can tell, it hits a lot of categories and it's extremely holistic. So that enables companies to, not forget or cut corners in areas that maybe they haven't been focusing on. And it really just differentiates them as a purpose-driven company that's considered all of these categories.
Wow. Yeah, like you said, there's a ton of different places that they look and categories. So what's the process to have a company become certified?
Yeah, so what they do is they start by taking the B Impact Assessment, which is the assessment designed by B Lab, which is the nonprofit that started B Corp. And when they take this assessment, it covers those 5 categories that I mentioned, and they'll, have to improve their score in each of these categories and get up to at least 80 out of 200 points. So what that might look like is actively improving in these different categories by, incorporating a supplier code of conduct or an environmental management policy, are just 2 examples of a way that a company might improve. And then once they get up to that 80, then they submit their score to B Lab. And there's a waiting period of about 8 to 12 weeks right now, and that's constantly changing, but because there's such a high demand right now for B Corps to get certified, it just keeps getting longer. And then B Lab will randomly generate questions from your assessment that you then have to provide documentation to back up that you're actually doing it. And then once you go through that process, then you pay your certification fees and meet their legal requirements. And then you can officially be B Corp certified. So it's not easy, it's not short, it's rather rigorous, but very worthwhile.
No, it sounds like it. So then each year, do you have to renew that or resubmit that information? How does that
So
work?
every 3 years, a company has to recertify. And it's not quite as rigorous, every year to go through the recertification process. But they do have to do that again every 3 years.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, is this the same, is the B Corp the same as the beneficial corp?
No, so that's a great question. And a lot of people get that confused. So a benefit corporation is actually a legal structure. So similar to an S Corp or a C Corp, but essentially they have to commit to higher standards of purpose, transparency, and accountability. So a benefit corporation is a legal structure, which I don't actually do work in that area, but I help companies with the BCorp certification, which is what we're talking about. Now, companies do have to usually, not in all situations, but often they have to switch to become a benefit corporation within 2 years of getting certified. Not all the time. Like if you're an LLC, you can just amend your articles of incorporation. It's complicated and I won't go into it. But yes, so companies do have to often switch over, and that's to protect them in the long term. So by switching over to this, if you ever sell or whatever may happen down the line, you actually have your social and environmental commitments integrated into your foundational documents.
Excellent. Okay, that makes sense. Now back to the B Corp. I know that it's a growing trend. Maybe you could talk about that. Like it seems like it's becoming more popular, more important.
Yeah, it is. So right now there's about 3,400 plus B Corps across the globe, and this number keeps growing. So it was established in 2006, 2007 was the first time that they certified B Corps, I think around 80 or so. And even just within the past 3 years, this number of certified B Corps has grown by about 50%. So it's rapidly increasing. It's still a small number of businesses across the globe, 3,400. But we're seeing a lot of leaders step into the space, large multinational public companies for the first time, like Danone North America as an example, and then some smaller purpose-driven companies that you probably know of that are certified B Corps would be like Patagonia, Warby Parker, Swell, Chris King, Allbirds. So it's a growing movement for sure.
Excellent. And why, besides just doing better for the planet and the people who live on it, what are some of the motivations for the companies to do this, to pursue?
Yeah, great question. So the reason that we love it at Everroot is because it's an amazing benchmarking tool for companies. That's not always the first reason that companies decide to get certified, but I think it's the most important. So if you think about it, you're going through this extremely holistic assessment, and maybe you're doing things really well when it comes to your workers. You're offering them great benefits. They're highly satisfied and engaged, but you haven't yet considered your impact on the environment and you don't really know where to start. This is an amazing tool for a company to actually look at those areas that they might be neglecting. And then on top of that, they can compare with other leading businesses across the globe that are held to the same standards as them. So I've heard from, or like the CEO of Cabot Creamery talks about how he likes to compare his scores to the scores of Patagonia, who scores 20 to 40 points higher, and they can gather ideas and learn from them. So that's why a business might be inclined. Oftentimes they're inclined because of the community aspect. So not only are they comparing scores with B Corps, but they get to collaborate with them and doing giveaways, events, learning opportunities, and all of that. So those are two of the benefits for businesses.
That's interesting. I mean, in the public space, sustainable investing has become a huge driver for people. I just saw that over now $1 trillion is invested in companies exclusively that perform well in ESG, which sounds like similar metrics, maybe not exactly the same. So it sounds like even in private companies and some of the others, that's pushing B Corps.
Yeah, definitely. And conventional investors are more and more looking at the same standards of transparency and accountability that impact investors have been looking at for decades. Vincent Stanley talks about that, the shift as BlackRock has invested in multiple B Corps, and it's definitely a growing movement in that space as well.
Excellent. Well, so how do you help companies, and I don't know if they're just local or not, in getting their B Corp certification?
Yeah, so when they're going through the B Corp certification process, usually they'll take the assessment and we'll go through and we'll help them identify areas for improvement, and then work with them to either formalize things that they're already doing by writing different policies or helping them actually establish new programs. So it's really rewarding work, and we work with B Lab through the whole process, and they're submitting documentation. But it's so fun to work with business leaders and actually help them improve and spend time on things that they obviously really care about and want to be doing a good job, but they may not have the time or the money or the resources to have invested in it yet. So that's what our work looks like in short.
Oh, that's terrific. And I assume maybe you've got some of the feedback that a lot of the companies that achieve B Corp certification is partly to attract employees. Have you heard that?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the major benefits is that employees who work at B Corps tend to be more satisfied and engaged. And it makes a lot of sense when you think about it because, you know, they're having better benefits. They're offered cool opportunities for personal and professional development and all these things. So it makes sense that, you know, over time that they'd continue to feel more aligned with their mission and their values at work. And then also, you know, they're getting all these benefits that make them really excited to go to work every day.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Avery. We'll move on. We'll come back. We'll keep the conversation going, but I'd like Scott to hear more about Goodweave. Maybe start with the introduction and some background about Goodweave for those of us that aren't familiar with it.
Sure. Well, and that's probably most of it. We're actually a much smaller organization. And we're not quite as broad. Well, we're certainly not nearly as broad as B Corp, but we go very, very deep. The organization was founded in India 25 years ago by Kailash Vidyarthi. Kailash is a long-time child rights activist. And in 2014, he was the co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize with Malala. The organization has pioneered a holistic approach to harnessing the market power, working with brands and producers, and focusing on shining a light on these hidden supply chains. This is where child labor, forced labor, bonded labor, where all the most marginalized and vulnerable workers are, you know, really just, they're working anonymously. I mean, recently there was a while back, there was a study that showed that 85%, just in India, 85% of the non-agricultural workforce is made up of informal workers. And that's due to a large outsourcing, a reliance on outsourcing of labor, which is where a lot of the pressure for pricing comes. So at the very heart of what it is that Goodweave does is a standard that we work with labor rights experts, with multinationals and various stakeholders, labor rights organizations, and you know, various other organizations to create the standard. And with that, you know, we work. It provides us assurance on behalf of the producers and manufacturers that those goods have been ethically produced, without child labor, forced labor, or bonded labor. We don't outsource any of that work. It's all our people. We have, you know, over 120, 130 people on the ground just in India. They provide the inspection, the monitoring. And then when we find, one of the differences between what we're doing and a lot of the other organizations are doing is that when we find an issue, we actually provide the remediation. So if we find child labor, we remove that child. We provide any rehabilitation that's required. We provide them with education services. In some cases, we've had schools. So there's a kind of a very holistic approach to ending child labor.
What industries have you seen that have the most prevalence of child labor?
Well, yeah, it's really not industries as much as it is how developed the countries are. I mean, there's child labor here in the United States. You know, which is why you have organizations that are working on certifying tomatoes. I mean, it's so they're child labor. It's not something that's specific to a particular industry. There are highly mechanized industries where, you know, you're unlikely to find it in a car manufacturing facility in Detroit, but where there are consumer goods and more and more as there's fast fashion meaning clothing, meaning home textiles, furniture, whatever. There's a problem, and the countries in South Asia are really highly dependent upon these informal workers, and the supply chains are so convoluted that there's this ability for most Western companies to just have plausible deniability. You know, they don't see it and it isn't there. So what we do is we shine a light on it, and then we work with the companies. You know, we're not like the police, where we work with the companies to fix the problem and to make the workplace better.
Right. No, that makes sense. So do you focus then on geographically helping, or are you specifically looking at maybe one type of textile more than another? Or?
Yeah, well, we were, for the longest time, we were really focused strictly on the rugs, because the rug industry in India, in Pakistan, and Afghanistan, you know, were notorious, and Nepal. So those are the countries that we work in. More recently, other types of companies have asked us to get more involved. They've seen the model, they know it works. I mean, we work with small companies. We also work with some bigger, you know, multinational companies. And so they've asked us to get into like fashion jewelry, into, you know, we've been getting into apparel. We've recently been asked to do a test in Bangladesh. You know, I mean, it's just various funders and/or companies have come to us and asked us to see if that model will apply to something else. I mean, we've been as far afield as certifying brick kilns in Nepal, because forced labor, slavery. I mean, it's kind of what brick kilns are based on. So, you know, we've done that. It's not something that is an export good, obviously. So it's not something that we sought out.
Great. All right.
Anyway,
Well, thank you. That sounds like, I mean, that sounds terrific, like terrific work. That's awesome. Mary, let's ask you about fair trade, maybe a little bit of history and the origin and what you guys are doing now.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to say as well, it's so inspiring being here with other speakers who are doing so much good in the world, whether it's with companies here at home on some of their policies internally, or, you know, trying to rid child labor around the world. It's very inspiring. In terms of fair trade, like me, it got its start in the 80s. Fair trade was born out of the collapse of the International Coffee Agreement. So our origin story goes that a Dutch monk named Frans van der Hoff, who's still alive today, and I've had the pleasure of meeting him, was doing a missionary in coffee farms in Mexico at the time. And when the International Coffee Agreement collapsed and the price of coffee just went on a downward spiral, coffee farmers were simply abandoning their farms. It did not make sense to harvest coffee and sell it at a loss and to do all that work and to earn less money than it would cost for the effort. So they were abandoning their farms and going and trying to find work elsewhere, going into cities, trying to find work. Frans van der Hoff saw this happening and thought, this is ridiculous. People around the world are still drinking coffee. People are still paying a premium for coffee, and yet these farmers are leaving the berries on the trees to rot because they're not earning enough money for it. So he started actually his own coffee company called Max Havelaar, which was based on a book in the Netherlands about a colonial explorer who went to Sumatra and discovered injustices in coffee in Sumatra. And so so he started it with a number of other nonprofits in the Netherlands at the time. And it just really kicked off in terms of people thinking, yeah, this makes sense. People should get paid fairly for what they're growing. I want to make sure my purchases are helping and not harming. And it transformed into not a brand as it started out as, which it was really just a buy this one farm's coffee. It was more of a pop-up, as it were. And it became much more of a label. So throughout the 1990s in Europe, there were many different fair trade labels, and they tended to be country-based. So In the Netherlands, as well as in Belgium and France, they have this Max Havelaar label. In Germany, it was trans fair. In the United Kingdom, it was something different. And so in the late 90s, early 2000s, all of these different labels, different systems, different standards banded together and under what is now known as Fair Trade International. And this was to make a single standard, single system, single label so that there was a lot less confusion in the market. And I think that that's one of the strengths of fair trade today, is that by having an international symbol, you can go to any country in the world and know that what it means, what it stands for, be able to read up about it and know what brands are doing for it. In terms of what that label means, it's very similar to what Scott was describing with Goodweave. It's a series of economic, social, and environmental standards that not only the farms have to follow in the countries that we work in, but also businesses have to follow in how they utilize their goods. Not only does it do some similar things as Scott was mentioning in terms of banning child labor, forced labor, bonded labor, it also has other benefits in terms of setting a minimum price, which is the floor price. We encourage businesses to pay over the minimum price, but trying to avoid that bottom falling out of the market situation. Speaking of which, if anybody here tracks the price of coffee, you'll know that it's been hovering around $1 for a long time now. When the coffee market, quote unquote, collapsed in the 80s, it was because coffee was around 80 cents per pound. And I think we'd all imagine that a 20 cents differential between the 80s and today, it's not looking too much better for coffee farmers. So having that floor price is really only important for when the bottom falls out of the market, which it's currently doing today. And then there's a fair trade premium, which goes on top, which is an extra price paid, and that farmers and workers get to democratically decide amongst themselves what they want that extra payment to go towards. It can be anything from clinics, schools, infrastructure, investing in machinery in their business. It can be simply a payout. We're trying to avoid some of the other charitable models out there, like a one-for-one model where you buy a pair of shoes and someone else gets one. They might not want shoes, they might want clean water, they might want a school, and it's really for them to decide, not for us to decide what's important to them. So that's the basics of the fair trade model.
Interesting. And so you brought up coffee a few times. Is that mostly where you concentrate, or is that the origin? Has it expanded?
I think that's what most people know fair trade for. And I would say about 40 to 50% of our producers that we work with are in coffee, but we've expanded. Fair trade is working in many different commodity goods. We certify about 300 goods around the world. The main ones are coffee, cocoa, mainly sourced from West Africa, which you were asking, or somebody in the chat was asking about what industries are prevalent in child labor. Cocoa. Cocoa is very prevalent in child labor. Cane sugar, cotton, bananas, and tropical produce. Mainly, it's a lot of things that we simply don't grow in the global north in countries like the US or in Europe, and that we're importing all the time. Also, I think it's important to note today, in terms of all of the movements that have been happening for racial justice, a lot of inequities between the trade of these countries and ours is due to colonialism, essentially. I mean, the reason why a lot of our tea comes from Kenya, for example, is because when the British colonized India and said, oh, tea's working really well here, they found one of their other colonies that had a great climate for tea and grew it there. So we're working with some of the historical structures of colonialism, and unfortunately still trying to make sure that people are getting a fair wage for their hard labor, and for which we enjoy maybe every single day in the morning, as I do with my coffee.
That's great. And so do you primarily work with North American companies then that are importing or using those commodities? Are those your...
So Fair Trade America does, yes. So that's our role here in the United States, is to work with companies similar to what Avery was saying in terms of helping them understand their supply chains and to make changes to better support the farmers and workers in their supply chains and switching to certified chains. But we also try and educate shoppers in the United States and educate what it means when these products are coming over to you. You know, the fact that a banana is probably the cheapest fruit in the grocery store, and the journey that it takes to get to us versus the apples that are grown locally. It's things that unfortunately we're still not thinking about too much, saying that the coronavirus crisis has really made a lot of people suddenly very aware of global supply chains. So in a weird way, we're hoping that more and more shoppers will be aware of where their goods come from and what it means when it gets to them. And then finally, we're trying to influence government in terms of some of the issues that we're working in, like child labor. There's the Harkin Engen protocol, for example, that was trying to address child labor in cocoa. And so we're trying to work with, you know, just making sure that we're the type of country that doesn't think that these things are acceptable. Although, as Scott said, it doesn't mean they're not present here either.
Right. Yeah. I think that's always a good point and a good reminder. Scott, let's go back to you real quick. We didn't talk about how has coronavirus impacted what you're trying to do?
Yeah, well, significantly. And most companies, consumer goods companies that are sourcing from certainly South Asia, which is what I know more about, are very, very concerned, because the pandemic has made it, you know, I think everybody watched the migration of workers from the production back to their villages. And in many cases, the workers have not been able to come back, even as they've tried to open in a small way. You know, in some cases, like in certain parts of India, the various color zones, they've allowed them to open, you know, like 30% or, you know, various capacity levels, though nobody really knows how they're going to police that. The problem is that they can't get the workers back. And India is trying to work, you know, I'm just using India as an example, is trying to work with a lot of the companies and provide various means to get workers back from the villages to the production sites. In the meantime, you know, there's been an incredible pressure put on the pricing of goods. So as I said, 85% of the workforce in India alone are these informal laborers. There's nobody to protect them. So the only place to really, you know, reduce the cost for a lot of these producers is labor. So, you know, COVID is having a major impact on that. And it's also making it difficult for organizations like ours to actually do the inspection and monitoring that we would do physically. So there is a lot of stuff happening that we can't even see at this point.
And Mary, are you seeing something similar with fair trade?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there have been reports coming out that in many different issue area or commodity areas, not just cocoa, but especially in cocoa, that there's an expected increase in child labor. And that's a combination of a lack of monitoring, like Scott was mentioned, as well as the fact of if schools are closed, you know, and people are maybe struggling more financially, what's going to happen with that, and where are children to go. In terms of what fair trade is doing, is that we are seeking funds for our producer groups on the ground and doing some relief and resilience funding. Part of that is coming from our own pockets, our own reserves. We're not just asking people to fund and support in that way. Part of it's coming from the businesses that are working in their supply chains in which these producers operate as well, because they want to see their supply chains remain intact. Something that we've been seeing happening with the coffee harvest now in like Peru and other areas is that there's migrant labor, as Scott was saying, where even though the coffee farmers we work with tend to only own a few acres of land, they're not they're not large farms, they're small farms, they are family farms. They tend to get migrant workers who come in and pick the coffee at harvest season because it needs to get off of the trees as quickly as possible. With restrictions on borders and also with health concerns, they're seeing already that it's taking longer to pick the coffee because they're trying to keep everybody safe. They might have less workers. And then in addition to that, between the time that the coffee is picked or not, there might be more spoilage. And so we're expecting to see prices increasing, but not necessarily the margins increasing for farmers, it's going to be a lot more work and a lot more risk on their end. And as we've been seeing here in the United States, there's probably going to be shortages as well.
Interesting. What about you, Avery? What has happened with COVID in terms of getting the interest in B Corp certification, the time that it takes?
Yeah, great question. So as you all know, it's obviously affected businesses all over the globe having to shift over their operations and, you know, becoming, a lot of them becoming virtual companies. And then at the same time, you know, trying to make sure that they're still making socially responsible, environmentally responsible decisions while their bottom lines are being affected. So it's been really cool to see so many B Corps in the community really step up and not only be resources for each other, but also to the greater community. You know, a ton of companies have donated, both Dr. Bronner's and I think it was Unilever donated a ton of hand sanitizer all over the globe to frontline workers, and seeing just initiatives like that happen again and again. And we'll see, you know, how businesses, particularly B Corps, fare during the COVID-19 crisis. They were 63% more likely to survive than businesses of a similar size in the last financial crisis. And B Corp likes to talk about that, how they were resilient then. So there's been more and more studies coming out showing and testing to see if they'll stand up during this crisis.
That makes sense. So Avery, I know that you did some work for SCA before. How, and this is a question from the audience for each of you, is can you share how you became involved in this work?
Became involved in the work for
Everroot.
So yeah, I mean, it's interesting really hearing from Mary and Scott talking about, you know, all of these major issues and supply chains and human rights issues and forced labor and child labor. And at least for me personally, going way back when I was in high school, I did my senior thesis on ethical trade in the global food industry. And that was the first time that I became aware of a lot of the issues that they were both talking about. Yeah, so going through school after that, just realizing that, you know, businesses have the responsibility to step up and make sure that they're not causing major harm, but that they're also doing good. And I found this opportunity to do consulting and actually help businesses that want to improve and want to be making a difference. You know, being that middle person to help them achieve those goals just was really exciting to me. And of course, you know, B Corp only goes so far when it comes to human rights issues, but it does address it. And, you know, companies get additional points if they have outside certifications like fair trade or other certifications. So it's cool to see, you know, the overlap there and to continue to work in this space.
Excellent. What about you, Scott? What inspired you to be part of it?
Yeah, my story is a little strange in that I had a full career working for British American Tobacco. I opened up a large chunk of Eastern Europe for them. And after decades of working without a conscience, I left the tobacco industry and wanted to get into something that made me feel better. And as Jonathan knows, since he as he said, he crashed my honeymoon in Thailand. And while we were in Thailand and Vietnam and Cambodia, I met a number of Buddhists and was just asking, you know, what explain it to me, give me kind of the idiot's version here. And the way it was explained to me really resonated, is that when everybody is born, you're just like this big barrel of incredibly fresh, clear water, sweet water. And every time you do something wrong, you put a little salt in there. And then, you know, and it never goes away. But if you do enough good things, because when you do something good, you put more fresh water in. So if you do enough good, it gets it to where the water's really not salty anymore. And so that's what I'm doing. I'm putting in some fresh water.
Excellent, excellent. What about you, Mary?
Yeah, so I lived and worked in the UK for about 8 years. I'm an East Coast gal, hence the lack of accent. But I lived and worked in the UK for about 8 years. And I worked in mainly nonprofits, whether it was a contemporary art festival or a homelessness nonprofit or a youth training organization. And the one thing that they all had in common was in their office kitchens, they all serve fair trade tea and coffee. And they all made a point of saying it too. Like, would you like a fair trade coffee? And coming from the US and not really experiencing that too much, I was like, why are you making this a big deal? Why don't you just say coffee? And basically saw it in the grocery stores, not just in the UK, but in traveling in Europe as well. It's much more widespread. When I moved back to the United States around 6 years ago, realized it's not as widespread here. And it was serendipity that Fair Trade was also hiring around that time. Because after working in multiple traditional nonprofits, which I think is based on that altruism model of please help these wayward youths, please help these homeless people, please help this, please give of your money encouragingly. Fair trade's more about, can you just pay people for what you're already buying and do it fairly? You're already buying the coffee. Why do we need to set up a foundation to help coffee farmers because they can't make enough money in coffee? That just does not make sense. So I love the market-based approach of fair trade. It's a nonprofit still, but it's very much looking at market solutions versus trying to correct existing unfair trade with a layer of philanthropy that makes people feel well and good, but really doesn't address the underlying problems.
That's really interesting. Now, I saw that Starbucks is one of your biggest, would it be client? Is that the right term for it?
Yeah, I wouldn't say so. So Starbucks is a large client in Europe, where again, they just have more criteria in terms of shoppers do. So for instance, in most Starbucks cafes in Europe, you will have a choice of fair trade espresso in your espresso drinks. In the United States, quite honestly, the demand is not that high yet. We're working to change that. We think that there is growth possibility here. We think that if more Americans knew about some of the issue areas, they would be interested. And to be perfectly honest as well, as some of the product areas that we work in become more and more scarce due to the fact that the average age of a cocoa farmer, for example, is 50 in countries where life expectancy is 60. The more that we have youth not going into farming, the more that we have climate change destroying the habitats and people destroying the habitats in which farms are, because there is no money in it, that youth are seeing there's more opportunity to go to the city, the more that market forces will prevail and we will no longer have products like chocolate or coffee. So we think that this is an issue that if Americans don't care about it now, they'll care about it very soon when all of a sudden it becomes much harder to find. But getting back to your question, Starbucks is a larger client in the European market. In the United States, they only have a couple of bags of fair trade certified coffee here.
Wow. My biggest takeaway is that I am the age of the average cocoa worker, which should frighten the the whole supply chain there. From the audience, we had a question, Scott, can you talk about your organization's governance structure and the pros and cons with that? And then also from there.
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, to me, one of the cons about our organization's structure is it was set up by an activist and not by business. And given the fact that we work, really connecting the importers and brands to the supply chain, we rely heavily upon funders, donations, that type of thing. So licensing fees really don't represent a significant amount or as significant as it should. The governance structure is set up as there's an international secretariat, and then in each country there is a separate foundation which is governed by that international secretariat. And each of those foundations have their own boards. But again, they all then are their oversight is by the International Secretariat. And the cons of that, I mean, the pros are, it gives us the opportunity to, well, we would have the opportunity to expand more easily, I think, in that sense. But you know, the grassroots nature of what we do makes it difficult because it's very labor intensive currently. The negative on that, though, is that there are times where you know, one of the country foundations will kind of go off the rails. And despite ongoing pressure by the international organization, I mean, there's been a time where we've actually had to get one of those organizations out and restart. So that's the con, I would say. It can be unwieldy.
I can imagine. What about you, Mary?
Yeah, actually weirdly similar to Scott, slightly different. So I said before, I'm from Fair Trade America, and I mentioned Fair Trade International, and I mentioned that there's a number of other countries in which fair trade operates. So we are all separate members. We're not a strict parent organization, child organization type of structure. And in addition to that, we have operations in all of what we call our producer networks, which is in Latin America, Caribbean, Africa, and Asia and Asia Pacific. Each member gets a say. And in addition to that, at our General Assembly, we have a 50% producer vote and producer voice. We think that this is one of our crown jewels in many respects, because I think now more than ever, with the talk about true representation, the talk about bias in organizations, if you don't have the voices of the people you're working for at the very top in an equal manner, what does it matter? Then you're just falling into so many tropes. And so we have a 50% producer recognition on our General Assembly and producer voice. That can slow things down. I think another desire of organizations these days is this just like, you know, you do the research, you pick a direction, you get investment, and you go. And with so many voices at the table, that is just not happening in that way. So I think that while it makes us really strong, because whenever we go in a certain direction, we're going forward very thoughtfully and considering the people who we are operating for at the very heart of it, and it makes sense to them, it also doesn't necessarily make sense in the market. A good example of this is that in coffee, for example, I mentioned small farms, you know, these like couple acre plots of land. There was a debate a few years ago if we should go into coffee plantations, where you have, it's more of a corporation style and they employ just many, many, many workers, and it's the corporation who owns the farm. About 70% of the world's coffee is grown by smallholder farmers. It's not the majority grown by these large corporations. And ultimately, our producers and the organizations themselves thought, we don't want to further put a stamp on corporations when we could be better supporting smallholder farmers. So we chose not to certify large corporation farms in coffee, and instead only certify smaller farmers. And to be honest, we've lost business because of that. We've lost opportunities in the market, and we can't work with certain businesses because they only source from these large farms. I'm not saying they're doing it bad. I'm just saying that we didn't feel like it was right for our system. So yes, a lot of discussions, a lot of voice happening in our organization, but I think it means we go forward with thought and intention truly in mind.
Okay, that's great. I think both of you really brought up the same thing, which is you're trying to get representation from the people and the organizations that you're most trying to benefit, but at the same time, since they're spread across the world, that causes its own set of issues.
Yeah,
you can imagine it's incredibly complex to keep this moving forward. On that note, and we'll start with Avery, what are the trends you're seeing? What are the plans for the future for Everroot Consulting? Areas that you'd like to expand into that maybe you don't have yet, anything like that?
Yeah. So for the future, I mean, right now we work with all different types of companies. Again, like I mentioned, any type of company can get B Corp certified. So we've worked with international farms, product companies, food and beverage companies, technology, financial, you name it. And the goal is, you know, it's not about necessarily the size of the company or our goal. You know, we want to continue to work with different types of companies because we do believe that any type of business can be a catalyst for social and environmental change. So I think as we, you know, continue to grow, it's just engaging with, you know, those leaders that want to make a difference. And of course, you know, we're excited to work with larger companies in the future because, you know, the larger the company, the more touches. But it's just so meaningful working with the smaller ones as well. So we're excited to continue to grow the B Corp movement, to continue to educate people on the benefits, hope that more people just go through and take the assessment because it's a free tool that any company can use to improve their impact. So just to continue to raise awareness for that and then be that support system for business leaders.
Excellent. Thank you, Avery. And what about your organization, Scott?
Oh, well, I would say aside from expanding into other categories and/or countries, really the organization has been focusing on a capacity building. We started that with Rainforest Alliance, working with them to shore up their work with ensuring there's no child labor. Worked with them on helping them actually with their standards and then their on the ground work. So we were working with them in the Tea Estates in the Somme. And from that, that's the work I was talking about in Bangladesh, is working with other grassroots organizations to take our model and embed it. And what we found just from the work that we had with Rainforest Alliance is that it's essential to work with the right partners. You know, otherwise it just becomes a sham. Our work is very rigorous, and as a result, we've expanded very slowly. But we also know that we cannot scale without being able to build capacity in other organizations. So that's really where we're going.
Thank you, Scott. What about you guys, Mary?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, we are not as well known as we are in Europe. In Europe, there's about a 90% recognition of fair trade amongst shoppers. In the US, it's around 30, which depending on your own familiarity, you're like, really? Or you're like, yeah, I've never heard of it. And so, but we're expecting huge growth. We've been seeing a real uptick in the market. So for instance, Nielsen did a study recently that showed that fair trade chocolate is growing at 5 times the rate of conventional chocolate. So there's definitely a growth in this market, growth in this movement. People want to know where their food is coming from. There's been enough horror stories out there about inequalities or straight up human rights violation in supply chains, especially with the current call out culture that we're experiencing at the moment. You know, brands are really looking at, you know, they can't just put up a black square on social media. They can't just make a vague statement. They really have to walk their talk. And so we've been seeing an uptick in terms of interest in fair trade, and we're hoping that that'll carry into the new year, crisis or not. I mean, people need to have robust supply chains during this time. So we're seeing an uptick.
Excellent. Good, good. Well, is there anything any of you would like to share as a final comment? I know it looks like we're almost done with our hour, and I've appreciated all the time and all the comments. I don't know if you've seen the screen, but I think everyone's really reacted to your stories collectively and the good work you're doing. So Avery, is there anything you'd like to end with?
No, I'm just excited to see, you know, all 3 of these certifications really continue to grow. And I think they all have a piece together, you know, thinking about the fact that you have to have responsible supply chains to run responsible businesses that are touching your workers and the rest of the globe. So I think they all have a piece in the story.
Excellent. And Scott?
Yeah.
Oh, Mary?
Oh, I was just going to
Go
say,
ahead.
I agree with that. And, you know, I hope that if anybody has any further questions for me or for Fair Trade as well, they can reach out. You can find me on LinkedIn or on our website as well.
Excellent. Scott?
Yeah, all I can say is that, first of all, thank you again for the opportunity. And we are one of those organizations that have been quietly working for 25 years. Very few people know us. So having an opportunity to get out there and just, number one, get out the name, and two, to help people understand that, you know, these supply chains are really, they are hidden, you know, and transparency is a key issue, and it's increasingly so as legislation continues to point towards a future where companies are going to be held accountable. So, you know, we feel good to be, you know, in that arena where we can be part of the solution.
Excellent. Well, thank you all again, panelists. I think that's wonderful. I think to use Scott's analogy, definitely want to have more freshwater around.
Yeah.
I think that'll make sense. So I appreciate it. And everyone who's watching, you can revisit this online for us and shoot us an email if you have other questions. But I think that will be it for right now.
Thank you.
So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.